Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We are pleased to welcome you to Qatar Career Development Center's webinar series, our special edition, Celebrating Neurodiversity and Inclusion. As part of our efforts in QCDC to support people with disabilities and young people in the autism in particular, we are hosting a set of webinars to celebrate the 2022 Autism Awareness Month, the first of which you are attending today, aiming to provide our esteemed attendees with a foundational understanding of how we can create meaningful internship experiences for neurodiverse youth. My name is Efrosini Dimitrios Parampota, and for the last decade, I'm working with Qatar Career Development Center as a Senior Career Programs and Services Officer. I am privileged to lead QCDC's inclusive programs and chairing the working group with QCDC, Outsage Academy, the pre-university Education, Inclusion and Wellbeing Unit, as well as the Learning Center. Our work is centered around officially integrating the Career Readiness Program into Outsage curriculum and the Empower class. The aim is to attain approval from the Ministry of Education and Higher Education to issue a special high school diploma for students with disabilities, as well as use the framework to support overall Outsage student population. We also aim through this working group to benefit other students with learning challenges across the pre-university education and Qatar Foundation schools, as well as train other teachers and career counselors to deliver and build on the Career Readiness Program content. So what to expect from today's session? To set the tone, I would like to start with some useful information for our esteemed attendees. This webinar is recorded and it will be shared with you together with the presentation and other handout files with contact details. We appreciate your active participation through questions that you can type in the chat box. And in today's webinar, we'll start with an introduction about the Qatar Career Development Center and the inclusive initiatives that we run, as well as our distinguished guests. We will move to the presentation with discussion points for approximately an hour and 10 minutes. And then we will dedicate around 15 minutes to answer your questions. And before we close the event, we will provide you with an event survey. Please take the time to fill the survey, as your opinion is of much value to us. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Together with us is Dr. Stephen Shore and Dr. Robert Nassif. Dr. Robert Nassif has practiced for over 30 years as a psychologist. He's a graduate of Temple University, specializing in families of children with disabilities, and has published several articles on the subject, including the books Special Children, Challenged Parents, The Struggles and Rewards of Raising a Child with a Disability, as well as Autism in the Family, Caring and Coping Together. Dr. Nassif also co-edited Voices from the Spectrum with Dr. Ariel, and he presents locally, nationally, and internationally on issues related to family life with special needs. He has a special interest in the psychology of men. In 2008, Dr. Nassif was honored from the Children's Charity for his contributions to the autism community. Together with us as well is Dr. Stephen Shore, diagnosed with atypical development and strong autistic tendencies and too sick for outpatient treatment. Dr. Shore was recommended for institutionalization, nonverbal until the age of 4 and with much support from his parents, teachers, wife, and others. Stephen is now a professor at Delphi University, where his research focuses on matching best practice to the needs of people with autism. In addition to working with children and talking about life on the autism spectrum, Stephen is internationally renowned for presentations, consultations, and writings on lifespan issues pertinent to education, relationships, employment, advocacy, and disclosure. His most recent book, College for Students with Disabilities, combines personal stories and research for promoting success in higher education. A current board member of Autism Speaks, President Emeritus of the Asperger Autism Network and Advisory Board Member of the Autism Society. Dr. Shore serves on the boards of the U.S. Autism Association, the Board of Directors for Organization for Autism Research, and other autism-related organizations. We are pleased to share that QCDC has joined hands with both Dr. Shore and Dr. Nassif, and we will be introducing later this year a new project on supported employment for young people in the autism spectrum. So let's speak a little bit about the kind of work we are doing with QCDC before I give the floor to Dr. Shore and Dr. Nassif to speak more about how we can create inclusive internship opportunities. So in QCDC, we initiated in 2017 a pilot program called the Career Readiness after we signed a memorandum of understanding with Ausage Academy, as we are both members of Qatar Foundation. The program includes cross-structural interventions and project-based learning activities such as workshops, motivational talks, field trips, volunteering, and social responsibility projects, among others. Senior students also participate in internship opportunities and actively apply the employability skills they acquire. The students we are serving are actually with moderate learning challenges, including autism. They are part of the Ausage Academy, as well as others who are served under the Learning Center in Qatar Foundation. Given the groundbreaking success of the program, QCDC with Ausage Academy, the Learning Center, and the PUE Inclusion and Wellbeing Unit formed the working group that I spoke earlier about, with a plan to increase the outreach and impact to serve more students. The second project that we are working on is called the Inclusive Employment Project. This is a supported employment program for people with disabilities, with emphasis on people with autism. This project will complement the efforts invested in the past years through the Career Readiness Program for young people transitioning from secondary education to adulthood. The official work, together with Drs. Shore and Nassif, started back in November 2021, and we are very happy and very excited to continue our work and make it public. Also, through this project, as QCDC, we aim to promote meaningful and successful employment for individuals in the autism spectrum, especially those with the Asperger syndrome and other neurodiverse conditions as the rule rather than the exception. Neurodiversity refers to the idea that neurological differences, such as those in autism, ADHD, or learning disabilities, are normal variations in brain development. Who will be serving? So through this inclusive employment initiative, we are targeting students and young adults with disabilities, especially those with Asperger's syndrome. We are aiming also to engage employers, managers, job coaches, teachers, and other professionals in allied fields, as well as family members of neurodiverse youth. Of course, we will be more than happy to answer any questions as we are moving forward with this presentation and the dedicated time. The third very important initiative that we are piloting also next month in April 2022, coinciding also with the Autism Awareness Month, is the Inclusive Internships. The aim of such is to build internally across QF centers, divisions, and functions an inclusive employment culture, train concerned departments to onboard and interact with people with disabilities, as well as support transition of Qatar Foundation students from education to employment by giving them the opportunity to take internships within the foundation. And the last also program as QCDC that I would like to briefly speak about is the empirical evidence and research-driven activities. So to better inform the targeted initiatives for people with disabilities, QCDC integrated in 2018 the Career Guidance Stakeholders Platform, a focus group dedicated in discussing pertinent issues of career development, lifelong learning, and transition from secondary education to real-life settings. A set of recommendations was produced and disseminated to key partners involved, as well as influenced incumbent or future QCDC initiatives. In the last two editions of the Career Guidance Stakeholders Platform that were held in 2018 and 2022, one of the sub-themes explored the untapped potential to improve the transition of people with disabilities from secondary education into higher education and employment. And with this being said, I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Shore and Nassif for joining us today. And I would like to give them the floor to share with us the very, very interesting facts that they have prepared. Stephen, Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I will now share my screen. And let's see, here it is. There we go. So, assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's our honor to be with you. And thank you, Efrosini, for a great introduction. So as a result, we are going to go straight to the overview as to what is autism. What are some central themes that we are going to be looking at? And what we're going to start with is my idea of the 4 A's of autism. And this can serve as a guide for us so that we can promote fulfilling and productive lives for individuals on the autism spectrum and making that the rule rather than the exception. So that first A, we've been at this for over a generation. Organizations around the world have promoted awareness of autism from just a generation ago, where the prevalence rate was thought to be about 1 in 10,000. Autism thought as a rare psychiatric condition caused by poor parenting. Well, fortunately, we know much better now. And we're also much better at recognizing autism when it's in our midst, to the point where the Center for Disease Control in the United States accepts a prevalence rate of 1 in 44. And that is a lot of autism. 1 in 44. And so we're better now at recognizing autism at home, in the community, in education, and as we're talking about here, in employment as well. And once we recognize this autism, we can work towards acceptance. And what acceptance means is that we turn away from thinking of autism as a set of deficits, disorder, and disability, and we look at the abilities of autism, people on the autism spectrum. And we ask the question, what can the individual on the autism spectrum do? And in doing so, in asking the question in this way, we begin to appreciate what autistic people can bring to the community. And we are seeing this, for example, in large computer companies, IT firms, such as Apple, Microsoft, Google, who were the first ones to begin the process of actively seeking autistic individuals as their employees, because they realized that given our set of characteristics, there are some things that people on the autism spectrum can do much better than everybody else. And upon recognizing this, making a sound business decision, not a charitable decision, let's hire this poor person on the autism spectrum who won't get a job anywhere else, but more like, we recognize the ability of this person, whether it's a tendency to routine, which translates to showing up to work every single day on time. And I've yet to meet an employer who does not appreciate that. Looking at the skills that many of us have in IT, not all of us, but a number of us who do, doing things in coding, for example. And we're moving that to other areas as well, whether it's a company like Walmart, whether it's a smaller company run by parents, for example, that have just a few employees, recognizing the abilities that autistic individuals. And then there's the fourth A, which is action. And action is the glue, the work that we have to do to recognize autism when it's in our midst, to work with the characteristics for promoting success, fulfillment, and productivity, appreciating what people on the autism spectrum can bring to society. And in doing our work, my charge to you is, what actions are you going to take to climb these stairs of awareness, acceptance, and appreciation of people with differences in your lives? So let's take a look at an example. Let's take a look at an example of someone like Ahmed, who provides transportation system information to lost patrons at Hamad Airport. So Ahmed is a young adult, and like many of us on the spectrum, he has a fascination with transportation systems information. Airlines, for example, in his case. He would have been, someone like Ahmed would be diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, needing supports at level 1. His ability to communicate through spoken word is good. And we now take a look at his characteristics. And instead of defining them as deficits in communication, social interaction, and restricted interest, as we so often hear about when we talk about the defining autism, let's just look at them as characteristics to be worked with and ask the question, what are the employment implications? So people come to him and ask him, how do I get from one place to another? When does my flight take off? What gate is it at? When does it get to where I need to go? And he provides this information in a detailed, factual, data-driven, truthful, and perhaps even repetitive manner. Those are common speech characteristics of those of us on the autism spectrum. And now I ask you, how many of you want your airline information, airline itinerary information provided in a detailed, factual, data-driven, truthful? And how many of you have asked someone to repeat these directions as well? So that works. What about social interaction? When things are predictable, a position like this, he's approached by a patron, the person asks him the question, he's happy to oblige, and then they say goodbye. And his supervisors understand how Robert works, or I should say Ahmed works, and is able to provide him the support and predictability that he needs in order to be successful. Where does he get this information? His coworkers have to look it up in a computer. But for Ahmed, because this is one of his fascinations, instead of calling it a restricted interest, let's refer to this as a highly focused interest, or maybe just as a passion. So as a result, all of this information is memorized. So as a result, because he is on the autism spectrum, because he is autistic, he outperforms his coworkers, his typical coworkers, who are not on the autism spectrum. And this is how we need to be thinking about people who are autistic. I said autistic, or should I be using the terminology has autism. So what we're looking at here is the difference between identity first language and person first language. And I remember as I started getting more involved in the autism community, I noticed there were this group of people on the spectrum who were referring to themselves as autistic individuals. Well, isn't that a kind of a rude thing to do? And shouldn't we be thinking about the person as an individual and looking at their humanity first, who happens to have something? Well, I was very curious about this. So as a result, I gathered about 100 people on the autism spectrum in a room and asked this very question. Should we be using identity first language, which is where people identify with being on the spectrum, or should we be using person first language, where we'd be talking about individuals who have autism? And it was a very interesting discussion with these individuals. One person said that autism affects everything they do. It doesn't define them. It's not all they are, but it does affect everything they do. They don't see anything bad about it. It just kind of is. So they considered themselves as an autistic person. The next person responded and said, well, gee, autism isn't something that I can carry with me in a bag. And then hopefully I don't forget my bag of autism before I leave. And then another person responded with, well, I'd prefer to be recognized for my humanity, for the person I am who happens to have something. And then the response to that was, well, if we consider autism as an extension of the diversity of the human gene pool, then the autistic person is just as human as the next. And it went back and forth like that. And we finally voted. And the vote came down to about 80% in favor of identity first language. So what that suggests, and continues to today as I interact with my colleagues who are on the autism spectrum, is that we tend to prefer identity first language. And the proclamation was, most of us prefer identity first language. Some of us prefer person first language. We'll try not to have a meltdown if you use the one that we don't use. And when in doubt, just ask the individual on how they prefer to be referred to us. And on that note, I will turn you over to Dr. Nassif.
Thank you, Stephen, for your insight on those 4 A's, so important. And as the incidence of autism has risen, and everywhere around the world where it's being diagnosed, there's a similar prevalence. And as mentioned, it's now 1 in 44 children in the US, all of whom are part of this broad human family that we're all a part of. And 1 in 44 is over 2%. So we're talking about a lot of folks, and we're probably not recognizing them all yet. And these children grow up and become adults with autism. And that's why we're here today. What future will they have? Next slide. And one size doesn't fit all with autism. There's no single cause. Much of this is genetic, but it's on many genes. There's no single presentation. It doesn't look the same in everybody. The ability to socialize varies. There's challenges in relating. There's repetitive behaviors, which, as Stephen mentioned, can actually be an advantage in doing a job. There's an uncertain course, we don't know how far any child will develop. However, what we do know is that whenever someone is diagnosed on the autism spectrum, from the youngest child to adult, there's an excellent chance that they will continue to develop skills. And autism finally can co-occur with other conditions, such as anxiety, depression, and gastrointestinal problems, and so on. Next slide. There is actually no clear dividing line between the different levels of autism. We say there's 3, but who knows? You know, there's no clear dividing line, and there's no clear dividing line between those that have autism and the rest of the human spectrum. It's like the light spectrum. There's no clear dividing line between red and orange, between orange and yellow, between yellow and green, and so on. No clear dividing line. And wherever a child begins, chances are that child will develop over time. And that's what happened with Stephen. He started out with what Leo Connor described as autism, which today we would say was severe, and progressed to having, you know, milder symptoms, more language, more social skills, et cetera, et cetera. So we can look at this spectrum of possibilities. Now, most of the behaviors commonly labeled autistic behaviors, and we hope to help you understand this today, they're not actually deficits. They're strategies the person uses to feel better and emotionally regulated. And that's from Barry Prezant, the author of Uniquely Human. The label autism is really just the tip of the iceberg. The label is those characteristics that are spelled out in the diagnostic manual that we use. A little different in the US as opposed to internationally, but basically overlapping. But each individual has so many other characteristics, and that's what's below the surface. The individual differences are how we understand each person. So under that surface, we can find intelligence going from an intellectual disability to gifted intelligence. We can find social interaction varying from individuals that are not so interested in other people to individuals that have a variety of friendships, and everyone in between. In terms of communication, we can go from nonverbal, which we now call non-speaking, and maybe using signs and gestures to communicate, to what we would have called Asperger's syndrome, fluent language to communicate, and everything in between. We also find behaviors that vary from intense to mild. And sometimes they get in the way of things, but also they help an individual to emotionally regulate or calm themselves. The sensory system is really active in most autistic people, and this can go from not very sensitive and seeking sensation, like someone who likes strong hugs, firm hugs, to someone who's very sensitive, who doesn't like the feel of anyone touching them. And this can occur with sight, sound, taste, balance, gross motor, fine motor, can go from very uncoordinated, kind of awkward, to very coordinated, and everything in between. So we're going to just talk briefly about some central concepts, the myths around autism in the workplace. I'm just going to overview that, and then Stephen's going to take over. So there's several myths. You know, I'm just going to talk, I think, about 10 of them, but there's more that kind of many people believe and affect people in terms of being able to get a job. Not keep a job, get a job. People with autism tend to keep their jobs longer than neurotypical people. So the first myth is that people with autism are all alike. We know that's hardly the truth, but Rain Man was the movie that triggered a worldwide awareness of autism, but exceptionally very, very few were like Dustin Hoffman's character. People with autism are mentally disabled. That's a myth. They can go from cognitive disability to intellectually gifted. Scientists understand the cause of autism. Not really. Scientists are still struggling to understand it. There's well over 200 genes involved, and the interaction of genes and the environment. There are treatments that exist to cure autism. Again, false. The treatments help autistic children and adults to develop, but there is no known cure. If there was, there'd be a line from Doha to New York City. Autism's a kind of eccentricity. No, it's not. It's a different way of being human. Autism comes from bad parenting. That was one of the first theories. That's been soundly rebutted. But the converse is that engaged, active, positive parents are good for children with autism and help them develop. People with autism feel no empathy or affection. That's false. People with autism have all the feelings of everybody else. How they express them is often different. And people with autism have a keen appreciation for the feelings of other people on the spectrum whom they identify with. Children with autism flap and rock constantly. That's false. Some do, some rarely do. And again, a lot of things in between. People with autism are good at numbers. Well, many people with autism are good with numbers. Many neurotypical people are good with numbers, but all people with autism are not good with numbers. And I can't see number 10. I don't know what's on the bottom there. So can you fill that in, Stephen?
Yeah, I certainly can. I had to take myself off of mute. Yeah, so people on the autism spectrum are bad at verbal communication. And that's another myth. Some of us have difficulty, as Robert mentioned a little bit earlier, that we communicate in other ways through assistive communication devices. And just like other aspects of autism, it's a spectrum. I know many people on the autism spectrum who are better orators and better speakers than the typical population.
Okay, I think this is yours, Stephen. Oh, no, this is mine.
No, this is yours. So,
okay. So what we want to next think about out loud with you is the idea of reasonable accommodations in the workplace to help people with autism to succeed in a job. So a reasonable accommodation is an adjustment or modification made to a job or to the workplace or the manner or circumstances of performing the job that allows an applicant or employee with a disability, and we're really talking about any disability, to successfully apply for the job, perform the duties of the job, or enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment. So all the way from applying for the job, to doing the job, to getting the benefits, the equal pay and privileges of the employment. Reasonable accommodation, and we want to underline this again, also applies to the application process so that we're fairly interviewing or screening people with disabilities who may be able to do the job and get all the benefits of the job. So this young man actually knows the birthdays of everybody in his class. So think for a minute, and if anybody wants to take a stab at this or just a guess, what jobs might he be a good intern for if he knows the birthdays of everyone in his class? What do you think? Would he be good in the airport, at the bus terminal? Would he be good at, he could work in the school system? Yes. I see people are in the chat function, at the train station. What else? He could be an accountant, absolutely. You want your accountant to be so focused on details. And he could work in the supermarket.
oh, there's some great great suggestions here. The train station, human resources, the library. Yes, I know many people on the spectrum We're working in the library, making sure books are exactly where they belong on the shelves. And that works. It speaks to our sense of order.
Administrative work. Yes, he would not miss a detail.
No.
A math teacher. Wow. So many things he could qualify for. And maybe we're only scratching the surface, but I think you get the idea. And we thank you for your participation. And we're going to have questions and more discussion at the end.
Oh, here we go. Data analyst, IT section. Yes, this could be a great place for him.
Depends what he likes. But he can use those skills in so many ways. So there's accommodations that occur for various issues or characteristics. So for example, it may be difficult to remember instructions given verbally. So if you're the supervisor or coach for an intern, you can communicate instructions in writing as well as verbally. Instructions can be delivered by email or text. Questions can also be asked by email or text, and many autistic people prefer text-based communication. Text-based communication allows you to think about the question and think about your answer. So the emails or text are a written record, which the intern could review as needed if they're confused or if they get distracted. Another possibility, if an individual is more of an auditory learner, is to record verbal instructions that can be listened to whenever necessary. And these days, we all have a smartphone in our pocket, which can do all of these things. So there's many sensory issues: sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touch, balance or vestibular, awareness of body position and movement, which is called proprioception, and awareness of internal body cues and sensations, interoception. So those issues may need accommodation, such as?
So one example is many of you may think that this hat's a fashion statement. And I suppose in many ways it is. And it's always good to support my university at Delphi University, where I'm a professor. But in actuality, it's really an accommodation. And because like many autistic individuals, I have visual sensitivities. And for me, being in a room with recessed lighting fixtures that are up in the ceiling is probably like looking into a spotlight for most other people. And here is the accommodation. So in this case, just a simple hat.
Also your brand, Stephen.
Well, yeah, that too. It's become my brand, yes.
Let's see the next slide. So with sensory issues, it's important to consider how to avoid the negative impact. Oh, we got something else in the chat. That young man could be a mechanical engineer with that great memory. If noise from fluorescent lights are a problem, set up a workstation near a window for natural light or provide an incandescent light. If the noise level, these are just examples, overall is a problem, consider noise canceling headphones. The intern will probably consider this, but what's important for the job coach or supervisor is the understanding that they're not listening to music, they are filtering out sounds that are overwhelming. If smells are a problem, locate the work area away from the kitchen and food smells and away from the strong disinfectant smells that building maintenance people use. There can be behavioral challenges in the sense of how long a person can function on their job without getting overstimulated. So limit the work hours to the time frame that behavioral challenges are minimal. So if you know behavioral challenges are minimal in the morning, the person's schedule should be a morning schedule, and then expand hours slowly as skills develop. A shorter day or fewer days per week can also be helpful. A consistent schedule is also key. A job coach or mentor can reinforce appropriate behavior and guide the intern toward being able to do better and better on the job, work for longer periods of time with consistency. This young man loves to help prepare food. Where can he be an intern? Let's see what ideas we have. Any ideas for him?
Oh, there we go. Restaurant, yes. Chef.
Home business, hotel food services. Now
Right.
we're cooking.
Yeah, cooking with gas.
Yes, so don't assume he can only cut the vegetables, assume he might be able to be a chef. Culinary chefs on food services. In the grocery store.
Coffee shop, yes.
So a lot of possibilities, and these possibilities exist all over Qatar. Food buffet, sure, he could be stocking that up.
Yeah, he certainly could.
Maybe he's taking care of the recipe books in the library and helping people find stuff that they're interested in. Okay, well, thank you for the participation. The chat's been pretty lively, and we'll have time for questions going forward. You can volunteer to test the waters in a safe environment initially, and then once he's comfortable, he can choose to remain there. So that's the concept of job sampling that we would want young people with disabilities to be doing, where they try various jobs, see where they're most comfortable, and then seek to remain in that position or a similar one going forward. So with inclusive internships, we would hopefully be able to offer students different experiences so they can test the waters, as this participant in our workshop points out. In terms of organization, visual schedules work well in educating children with autism. They work well in the workplace, and we all work well with schedules. One of the things Stephen and I say constantly is that what's good for people with autism is good for everybody else. So the visual schedule of tasks to do on the left, and then check off when they're finished. So that.
Oh yeah, and just to riff off of that, often after we've been working at training supervisors to better communicate with, better to understand autistic individuals, they often report that the work that they've done, the modifications that they've made in the workplace to better support their autistic and otherwise neurodiverse employees has made them better supervisors overall, as they've had to rethink on how they engage in their supervision.
Getting to work can be a challenge. So we want to have practical ways for the neurodiverse person to get to the workplace. Make sure the individual has had practice and exposure, so they're used to where they're going, they're used to what it looks like, sounds like, smells like, and how to just get around there until he or she is comfortable and has minimal anxiety. You can generally expect anxiety about going to a new place at a new time, etc. So we would recommend practicing getting there and getting used to the physical surroundings. And all through the time in the internship, social skills can be practiced. And we're going to be teaching these social skills in our inclusive employment training program. But we can be working on these in the internships, working on listening, being interested in other people's stories, doing better one-to-one conversations, being positive as opposed to negative, and avoiding complaining, remembering what people's stories, remembering their names. So these are skills that can be reinforced, taught, developed in an internship or employment situation. And go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, and what is particularly interesting about this list is that it comes from Indeed.com, which is an employment job matching site for typical people. It's not for people on the autism spectrum, people who are neurodiverse. Certainly people who are neurodiverse or autistic can use Indeed.com. But here they are making recommendations to everybody.
Great point. So any change or transition in schedule or routine needs to be planned in advance. A person with autism needs to know what to expect even more than neurotypical people. Of course, we all want to know what to expect. The differences need to be planned for, such as location, dress code at a special event, activities, etc. A person with autism needs to understand when expectations are different, such as group or individual activities. Group activities are generally speaking going to be more difficult. Planning in advance minimizes the difficulties and negative feelings that can come from different social expectations. All yours, Stephen.
All right, so now it's my turn. Understanding disability etiquette, both understanding etiquette from the viewpoint of the autistic individual and how to help that individual on the spectrum better understand the workplace. So let's begin with looking into the mind of the individual on the autism spectrum. And we go way back to where I was at age 10. I was in middle school. And I was awfully concerned about the letter E because I heard that you have to drop E before adding ing. And wasn't this E going to get hurt when it fell to the ground? I had a friend who said he felt like a pizza. He didn't look like one, he didn't smell like one. So there were some issues there as well. I also remember a class being interrupted by an announcement. The principal had lost his mother. So what does that mean? Principal had lost his mother. Well, what came to my mind was the millions of times that my parents had told me that whenever I lost something, it was in the last place I left it, which I always thought was a silly response because if I knew that, I wouldn't be asking them where this object was. However, I thought if that was a good enough answer for me, for my parents to give to me, perhaps I could be very helpful to the principal in helping him find his mother if he had lost her. What does it really mean? Well, this is known as an idiom. Principal had lost his mother. It means that she passed away. Well, that's yet another idiom. What does passed away mean? It means that his mother died. Well, had somebody explained that to me, I would not have made the suggestion that if he thought really hard as to where he last saw his mother, maybe he'd find her, and would be much more appropriate and express my condolences. So what this suggests is that autistic people tend to think very literally, just using words. Research suggests that up to 93% of interaction is nonverbal. And we know that many on the autism spectrum have difficulty perceiving and processing nonverbal communication. So we're left with the words. And this can create challenges in the workplace as well. So for example, a worker asks, has a question for a supervisor, and the supervisor says, I'll get to your question in a minute. Well, guess who is counting those 60 seconds before the supervisor returns with the answer? And so in that way, it's important to educate the individual on the spectrum, very much like I'm talking to you now, and teach what this means, that this is really an idiom. The supervisor will not necessarily get back to you in a minute. And then at the same time, educating the supervisor that if you're told that they'll get back to you in a minute, it's just a saying, it's just an idiom, and it may end up taking much longer. Another characteristic, black and white thinking. In some cases, it's good just to be focusing on the facts rather than getting tied up in the emotions. So that way, instead of looking at black and white thinking or very literal thinking as a deficit, let's find situations where it's important to be very literally minded. So if we go back to the chat, what might be some employment possibilities that would take advantage of this literal type of thinking, black and white thinking? So I'll be looking for some suggestions in the chat, like you had done before. Yes, you want your weather to be very factual and literal. Court reporter, yes, just the facts, just the facts. Getting back to IT programming. So 3 very good suggestions on possibilities, employment possibilities for those of us on the spectrum who tend towards this literal thinking. Security positions, yes. So as we think about language processing for autistic individuals, so much of our language is implied, whereas so much of our thinking is literal. And that leads to pragmatics or communicative intent in language. And so if we just think of this simple 7-word question and how this question is asked, do you want me to clean that room? Or do you want to clean that room? And what is the question really asking? As we emphasize the word you, it's really focusing on whether it's you or me who will clean that room. Versus, do you want to clean that room? And now the emphasis is on the room. Is it going to be this room, or is it going to be some other room? Well, let us suppose the emphasis is on the word want. Do you want to clean that room? And that may suggest, well, is this something you want to do, or is somebody else suggesting or forcing you to clean that particular room? And these are some of the things that we focus on when we look at training supervisors to better understand and communicate with autistic individuals. And we can also flip it and teach autistic individuals these very same concepts by discussing them the way we're discussing them now, by role playing. We found through our work that role playing and acting these things out can be very helpful, and especially when we contrast between doing it right or understanding what is being said correctly, you might say, and also what happens when a mistake is made. So we role play it in both ways. So I mentioned the hidden curriculum, and this is an important concept for autistic individuals. And that hidden curriculum focuses on the rules that everybody knows, but nobody talks about. And when you don't understand these rules, which can be challenging for autistic individuals because it's just expected that everybody knows these rules, combined with the fact that they're usually not found in any written material, such as an employee handbook. And again, getting back to role-playing videos, often I'll have autistic people, after we talk about a concept such as personal space, how close do you get to another person? I'll often have that person go onto YouTube and find short video clips as to where people are respecting personal space and what happens when personal space is not respected. So what is also important is that autistic people need to know the W and H questions we need to address. Why is this important in the first place? And that speaks to the logical mind that many of us on the autism spectrum have. And then for us supervisors who may be teaching or providing instructions for a job, we need to focus on how we teach it. How can we understand the mind of the autistic individual so that we can effectively teach? When is it appropriate to teach it? What are the skills? And what to say or do in order to communicate our support to the autistic person. And we can also think about that for the autistic individual as well, teaching that person the whens and the whats and the hows. And the key is that autistic people can learn the hidden curriculum. It's just a question of providing that direct instruction. So the workplace is full of hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum can be found everywhere. Whenever there's another person, whenever there's two people, there's always going to be unspoken expectations. And here are some challenges that many people face, whether they're autistic or not, based on certain rules and expectations in the workplace. And what is the lunch hour? I know very few people who take a full hour for their lunch hour and often eat at their desk. But if you have someone who interprets things literally, that can be a challenge, especially if the lunch hour is really at your desk or if it's a half hour or a different amount of time. Language, the 3 C's of language: clarity, concise, and be concrete. And so often I've heard supervisors give instructions very much like you see here when they're training someone for a job, and it will end up sounding very much like this. And that gives you a sense of what it can be like, as we're often overloaded by verbal communication. So providing information in bullet form, like you see on the upper right. And in doing so, in addition to helping the autistic individual, this type of concise, clear, and concrete communication is good for everybody else. Sometimes we need to talk through rules with the autistic person. So if you don't do these certain preparations for your job, what do you think is going to happen if you don't do that? What do you think is going to happen if you wear old clothes that may be torn? I know they're very comfortable for you, but how is that going to look in the workplace? say if you're working in a library, or you're working in a restaurant, or you're providing instructions like Ahmed did, as we talked about earlier on in this presentation. There's a certain way that you need to look. And if certain clothing provides or creates sensory issues, conflicts with sensory issues, then we need to find clothing that does work for that individual. Being consistent, consistency helps everybody. And speaking to the logical and rational side is always helpful for autistic individuals. And now I'll turn you over to Robert as we finish up with the benefits of inclusion and neurodiversity in the workplace.
So there's many benefits of inclusion of neurodiverse people. These are some of them. Neurodiverse individuals bring unique experiences and skill sets to the workplace, which build effectiveness and diversify your outlook. They help you think differently. Diversity of all kinds contributes to creativity, innovation, and competitiveness. That's what large corporations have found, as well as small employers. Greater diversity brings unique ideas and perspectives that we otherwise would not have. Neurodiverse individuals are an untapped pool of talent, and with up to 88% of autistic people worldwide being underemployed and unemployed, there's a huge resource to help fill the labor shortage gap that exists in many places. Neurodiverse companies, finally, have been proven to outthink and outperform heterogeneous organizations. People with dyslexia, for example, often have average or above average intelligence with excellent creative thinking skills. They tend to have strong problem solving and spatial reasoning capabilities that have been honed from their experiences with dyslexia. This allows them to see a variety of solutions to a problem. Autistic people tend to excel in areas that use or like rule-based thinking. Many organizations are experiencing benefits from including individuals with these strengths in their workforces. Neurodiversity limits groupthink. By this, we mean working with a diverse team, employees have more of an opportunity to learn from a range of workplace skills. In one study, someone with high inclusiveness was about 4 times more likely to increase their personal growth compared to someone with low inclusiveness. So it leads to personal growth for everyone. And summing up, look at these boys. And this is actually I grabbed this picture from a school in Qatar from Google Images. These boys are clearly paying attention to their teacher. What do you think? Do they have a future in the workplace when they're a little older?
And finally, inclusive internships are a step towards making meaningful and productive lives for neurodiverse people the rule rather than the exception. And this is the exciting work that we look forward to doing with you.
We have some questions rolling in.
Yeah, let's take a look.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shore. Thank you, Dr. Nassif, for this very illuminating presentation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. We do have questions posted, and I would like to make the best use of our time by engaging everyone in these discussions. The first question coming from Sarah: can people with autism make a family, and how interactive they are as father or husband?
Well,
I'll start. I'm a husband and I'm autistic, and I feel like I'm pretty interactive with my wife. I know many autistic people who are married, who have families and do well. And Robert, you continue.
So again, there's wide variability. One of the things that I see happening is as children get diagnosed, sometimes a parent realizes they have the characteristics, they get evaluated, and they turn out to be autistic. So if someone as a parent embraces their diagnosis, they can be a good parent like anyone else. And we also have, and I had this experience just even currently, a man came to me for diagnosis, and he was certainly lived with autism for 30 some years. He has a neurotypical son who he has trouble playing with because he didn't play that way. So he came to me to help understand his typical son. So there are definitely challenges, and there are many mothers with who have autism, who have autistic children. There's a big Facebook group in the UK. Anyone can join it, called Mums with Autism. There are mothers who have autism who are supporting each other in raising their children. So it really depends. Some people with autism want a life partner. Some do not. They prefer they prefer a single life. Some people prefer to be married. Some people prefer to have children.
I
So
think
what we
very much
see-
to the presentation, we need to acknowledge that autism is a spectrum. So there can be so many variations and choices for people to express themselves. Stephen, you were going to say something.
Yes, and that is, as Robert was saying, what we see is that we have the same diversities and variations in terms of relationships and types of relationships in autistic people that we see in the general population. And it's really just a matter of providing education for the autistic person in this area, and then education of others to understand the autistic person. And this can be generalized to employment as well, because I see a question here: can autistic people create reports and analyze data? And there are some of us who are supreme at analyzing data and creating reports. And just like the typical population, the non-autistic population, there are some autistic people where they really should be doing something else. And that is our job. That is our mission, is to find placements for autistic and otherwise neurodiverse people that speak to their strengths.
Absolutely, it's a principle that we touched upon earlier. So much of the work, and I will be speaking on behalf of QCDC as career development experts, we're doing with neurotypical people, identifying the strengths and the interests of neurotypical people. This is pretty much applicable also for neurodiverse clients. The most important thing is to accept their uniqueness and to find their strengths and talents in order to suggest suitable placements, something that it's going to be meaningful and fulfilling for the individual. We have also another question: can autistic people read facial expressions?
Well, it's a great question. Why do you think so many children with autism love cartoons, love anime in particular? Can anyone take a stab at that? I see what's going on in the chat.
Mm.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. We'll get to that later. So the facial expressions are very simple in anime and other animations. So that gives you the clue, and it kind of goes with what Stephen was saying. Things are either one way or another way. They're not in between. So mad, sad, glad, scared, very obvious in cartoons. So people with autism can read faces, but often they are challenged to read the more subtle social cues. So, but don't assume people with autism are not reading your facial cues or your tone of voice or picking up other cues about how you're really feeling, what you're really saying. Stephen might want to add to this.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes you'll find that autistic people can be better at these areas than the non-autistic person. And the reason why is, like myself, we have to study this and we have to think about it. We have to research into reading nonverbal communication. And if that becomes a highly focused interest or a special interest for the individual on the spectrum, that person can actually become better in these areas than the non-autistic person. So just like everything else, it's a spectrum.
I see a comment in the chat from Tatiana Nassar about emotional education for people with autism. By emotional education, I'm talking about, she says, explaining about every emotion's manifestation in the body and how to experience it without getting too anxious. Yes, Tatiana, that's exactly what I do as a psychotherapist.
And the good news is that there are many tools out there to help the autistic person understand their emotional states. The 5-point scale is one of many.
And we'll be using that in our extended training in the fall.
We're very excited about the prospects of this very important project. Another question, what is the role, importance of the agencies in preparing young individuals and creating inclusive internship experiences? Would you like to go first, Stephen and Robert? And of course, I will cover that too.
Well, we need partnerships.
Right.
Across agencies and schools and government and small businesses. We need these partnerships, and that's something we're attempting to build. And it's already begun, actually. Efrosini's work has already begun this.
And by working together in collaboration, we can do much more and go much further than any of us can do alone.
So we begin with partnerships, and then we pilot. So the Inclusive Internship Day is a pilot, and then we promote the success of the pilots to have broader acceptance in the community.
And I would say it's very much related to the 4 A's of autism that you spoke about, Stephen. First of all, by raising awareness, it's very much important to inform more people about autism, burst the myths, promote inclusion, and also take actions. That is primarily the role of these agencies. And of course, bringing on board experts like yourselves that can support best in creating these systems and putting this action in a good force, as force for good. We have another comment. People in the spectrum could be often misunderstood and can get frustrated when people tend to get displeased. Criticism need not to be taken well, as is the case with my son, who is an adult and cannot tolerate criticism. How do we manage this?
Well, it's really important to understand someone like her son, who's been autistic his whole life and has been in various situations misunderstood, criticized, really trouble getting things right, and eventually can become completely intolerant to anything, any suggestion. What's important is to reinforce everything he's doing properly. That's the lesson I learned with my son when he was little. Focus on what he can do. Focus on what he's doing properly. Your son needs a lot of positive reinforcement that's genuine and focused on what he's doing correctly. He has a lifetime of rejection and criticism that can be very hard to overcome. But this is the strategy I would recommend.
Yeah, and that gets back to one of the myths that we need to burst, and that is autistic people are not interested in social interaction. And what I find with my autistic colleagues and friends is that most of us do want to interact. But what happens? We get back to Robert's explanation about experiences of being wrong. And in grade school, for example, attempts to socially interact are commonly disastrous and end up with bullying. And so the autistic person begins to think, well, this social interaction thing that everybody so highly values just isn't worth it because it usually goes badly. And an interesting thing to think about is, what if the non-autistic person had the same number of challenging and negative experiences trying to socially interact as the autistic person does? What would the result be? It's not an experiment we can do, but it's interesting to think about.
To a certain extent, I think it's an issue of common sense. As you said, whatever applies to a neurotypical person also applies to a neurodiverse in terms of emotions. It's just how you express them, how you process them, and finding the right approach to address such issues. Another question, how can we address the cultural differences in the acceptance of some families that their kids work in apprenticeships, non-professional jobs, than going to university and getting jobs? That's a good question.
I think this is going to be a long process. Part of what we want to do is have more parent education, so that what we would need to, culture changes very slowly, as we all know, and I think you know very well. So we would probably need a few parents who are on board with not wanting their children sitting home the rest of their lives, and want their children to be doing something that's productive and have a feeling of success and be out in the community. We'll need just a few people initially to be role models for this. And parent education is really going to be key, that the schools and where children with special needs are being educated are partnering with parents to help them understand the future possibilities for their children. Of course, they would prefer their children going to universities, but we already know that even university graduates who are neurodiverse have an over 80% unemployment rate. So mere book knowledge without the social skills, without work experience, will not give their children the meaningful life that all parents really want for their children. So we hope to just make a teeny dent in this.
Absolutely. How difficult is it to find internship opportunities for individuals with severe levels of autism or an individual who is nonverbal? Well, it's actually pretty difficult.
It is. Let me provide an example of how this can be done. I know of a fellow in Florida who needs a lot of support. He would probably be diagnosed as being on the spectrum, needing supports at level 2 or maybe even level 3. He speaks very, very little. He's got a few words here and there, but he communicates mostly through pointing at pictures on an iPad. However, and he needs support in terms of maintaining his schedule, and as I mentioned, communication, travel, and many aspects of his life. However, he does have this curious interest in folding laundry, and he does it perfectly with all the creases in the right place. And I know many people who would like help with their laundry. And he would fly out to Doha in a moment to help you with your laundry. However, you'd have to pay him to do it because that is his job. He spends all day in a hot laundromat, pulling clothes out of a dryer, enjoying that sensory input from the hot, freshly dried clothes, folding them faster and better and with more enthusiasm than anybody else. And he enjoys his job. He's fulfilled. He is appreciated, that third step, that third A. He is appreciated by the laundromat, by his boss, by the people who receive the clothes that he's folded. And it all works out very well. However, what it does is it requires understanding where his strengths are instead of focusing on the deficits and looking at the deficits and being able to talk, non-speaking. Let's ask the question what he can do. And I've heard of similar situations of people working in an organization such as Walmart or some other company where an autistic person who doesn't speak and communicates through assistive communication devices, but he has a strong need for order and matching. And his job is to take items from shipping and match that item number, that stock number, to that same number that's on a shelf. And he puts it in the right place. And since everything has to be in order, everything is neatly lined up, everything is exactly where it belongs, like in a library. And he's enthusiastic and happy about this position. The most important thing for him, and for so many of us on the autism spectrum about employment, the most important aspect is doing the job and getting it done right.
Excellent points. Thank you so much, Stephen. This is also part of the efforts that we are investing, of what we are trying to do today, is to continue raising the awareness, continue engaging the important people, the key stakeholders, including parents, including employers, educators, coaches, and families in general, in the process of creating meaningful experiences for the people in the autism spectrum, as well as for other people with disabilities. By taking this first steps, I think we are creating this kind of change, the cultural shift that Robert, you spoke about a while ago, which is sometimes very slow, but when the tide is changing, I think a lot of good things can come out of that. We have another question. What is the role of expectation management in supporting effective internship programs?
I think it begins with understanding the person's abilities. What can the person do? And then once we determine what those abilities are, and when supervisors and managers understand how to communicate and work with and be with that autistic individual, then expectation management becomes clearer as to how that person will perform.
The disappointment that supervisors or others might experience is when the expectation is too high and the intern is failing. So I think that's what Stephen's getting at. When you match the expectations to the ability, that's a really important facet of making this a meaningful experience, so that the young person is learning how to work.
Any potential chances in turning internships into permanent jobs? The internships are actually the first step into creating job opportunities, because our young interns are building their skills and creating this kind of psychological safety within the workplace. There is an understanding, what Stephen and Robert were mentioning about the management expectations. There's a better understanding of the strengths, as well as what can be done in the workplace by an autistic individual, then this is how the potential are coming into fruition.
There's another question about, or comment, autistic people can be actors too, since they are good in memorizing and can live the emotions if explained correctly.
That is absolutely correct. And I know many autistic people who indicate that their social lives are only made possible because of their involvement in a drama class in grade school. Because drama class is where it's socially acceptable to be coached over and over on how to get a particular emotion or social interaction correct so that it's easily visible on the stage.
Great point, Stephen. Should we think about paid internships to motivate our interns? I would say yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. Everybody deserves to be paid for the effort that they are investing, whether being in the autism spectrum or not. So being fair and treating our neurodiverse interns the same way we would treat anyone else, it goes without saying. Employment and independent living still a big problem for persons in autism spectrum. Possible intervention on this.
Well, that is what we're addressing here, the employment piece. Anyways, and yes, that's right. It's depending upon the research you look at, up to 88% of those of us on the autism spectrum are under or unemployed.
Housing's a big challenge, and you know, there's in the States, there's numerous attempts to create small communities or group living situations. Sometimes a family will create an apartment within their home so that a young adult can live in the same household more independently. But this is a huge challenge. But we have seen in the employment program that Stephen and I were involved in, some of those young people, once they got good full-time jobs, were able to live independently. They'd been with their parents, you know, until then, into their late 20s and 30s. But once they had a meaningful job and earning enough money and learning the life skills they needed to take care of a small apartment, they were doing it. And these are individuals you would have thought, you know, they're just going to play video games the rest of their lives. They were sitting home, but they were educated and they had skills. And given the opportunity, they became independent. So I think there'll be success stories that can inspire other success stories, and hopefully more governmental and agency involvement in housing as well as employment.
We are 2 minutes over time. I want to thank very, very much, first of all, Dr. Robert Nassif and Dr. Stephen Shore for having this presentation and this discussion with us today. I want to thank everyone who tuned in and participated in this webinar. And of course, I would like to remind you, please make sure before you leave to fill in the survey that is provided in the chat. We appreciate your feedback. We look forward to having more conversations in light of the Autism Awareness Month. We have a lot of discussions planned, so please stay tuned. Stephen, Robert, thanks again for your wisdom. And also for your advocacy. We look forward to continuing our work. I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. And we're looking forward in celebrating neurodiversity.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Inshallah.
Thank you so much.